Okay, so without further ado, my name is Bill Keys, and I am the Program Manager for International House Philadelphia. And IHP's COO, Sarah Christie, is also on and helping manage the slides. So thank you, Sarah. I'll start out by giving some background on the international student population in the US, and then I will be followed by Maria Mihaylova, who is a Senior Associate at Klasko Immigration Law Partners, LLP in Philadelphia. And Maria will provide an overview of the hiring process and longer-term sponsorship options for international graduates. Then Chelsea Herskovitz is joining us, Chelsea is Assistant Director of the Steinbright Career Development Center at Drexel University. She will share some insights on how universities support international students in their transition to employment. So we're super excited to have Maria and Chelsea on board. To start out, Sarah, do you mind going to the next slide? Okay, so that's our speakers. And the next one, please. So for those not familiar with International House Philadelphia, we are a non-profit that has existed now for more than a century, supporting the international community in Philadelphia. In recent years, we have re-examined how International House can best address the needs of today's Philadelphia, while staying true to our core values of promoting internationalism, mutual understanding, and fostering a diverse global community. Back in 2019, we ended our legacy residential and arts programming and closed our former facility at 3701 Chestnut Street as part of a repositioning of our mission. IHP is now playing a bit of a different kind of international hub role by supporting people and organizations working to make Philadelphia more welcoming and globally connected. Supporting international students, however, remains a focus of our efforts. And in many conversations we've had with educators in the past year, it's become clear that there is something of an information gap in the US when it comes to employment for international graduates and students. Okay, so next slide, please, Sarah. So let me start by providing some context around the subject of international students in the USA. I have some direct experience with this topic, having worked with international student services for the past 7 years or so prior to joining IHP. So it's a topic near and dear to my heart. International student enrollments in US colleges and universities took off in the past few decades, with national numbers reaching a peak of well over 1 million students in the academic year starting in 2018, which you can see indicated on the graph here, top right. COVID-19 has had a severe dampening effect on international student mobility in the past couple of years, hence the sharp dip in the graph there. But there are indications that we will see a return to pre-pandemic numbers in the future. According to the most recent enrollment data available, well over 42,000 international students called Pennsylvania alone home in fall 2020. And then if we drill down to an even more local level, in that same academic year, there were upwards of 13,000 international students in Philadelphia County, and then more than 2,000 in the surrounding counties, so Montco, Bucks, and Chester counties. And then we have to bear in mind too that this data on student numbers comes from optional institutional reporting, so it's very likely that this is a big underrepresentation of the true numbers. So it's a pretty large international student population, not just in the USA as a whole, but distributed across the USA. As you can see from the graphic here on the bottom right, the top fields of study for international students are engineering, math or computer science, and business or management. Students in these fields tend to be highly pragmatic and career-driven in their choice of study, which is very understandable when you consider the investment that they make coming here to get an American education. Next slide, please, Sarah. International students diversify US campuses and supplement enrollment at a juncture in US history where many colleges and universities are facing unprecedented existential crises. I don't think that's an exaggeration to say. If you have a look at the graph on the bottom left here, we see a steady decline in enrollment across the last 10 years or so. So back in 2010, there were almost 21 million students in post-secondary education in the USA overall. And then you can see the numbers over this decade. First, they declined slowly, and then they kind of plummeted during the pandemic. So in fall 2020, there were a total of about 17.5 million students enrolled in US colleges and universities total. So that's American students, international students, everyone. And then this number, 17.5 million, is more than 4 million, 4 million students fewer than had been projected by the National Center for Education Statistics back in 2013. Revenues from international enrollment can provide a much needed infusion of capital, which is a key reason why many institutions have leaned into active recruitment of students from other countries, i.e. students who are not eligible for federal scholarships, and they often pay a higher tuition rate than their domestic peers. The graph on the bottom right here shows the economic impact of international students in the US overall since 2008. At the peak of the international enrollment in 2018 or 19, this population contributed nearly $41 billion total to the US economy. And that's in things like tuition revenue, spending on fixed expenses like housing and rent and food and things, but as well as discretionary spending. So despite the dip in enrollment since, in the 2020 academic year, international students in Pennsylvania alone contributed upwards of $1.5 billion to the state's economy, losing my voice a bit here, and directly supported 18,750 jobs. In the top right here, I've included a map of the state's post-secondary institutions by means of reference. So in many small communities, these institutions are key employers and economic drivers. In the US as a whole, according to NAFSA, which is the Association of International Educators, for every 7 international students enrolled, 3 US jobs are created and supported. Next slide, please. Beyond the quality of a US education, key factor that leads international students to choose the USA as a study destination is the opportunity to work for 1 to 3 years on their student visa after graduation in a role related to their field of study. And for some, the pathways to longer-term employment and permanent residency that exist for those starting their careers on a student visa. Maria will talk a bit more about this in her section, obviously, but there are some specific employment authorizations that these students must apply for through their universities and the US government before they seek work. Large companies tend to recognize the value of this talent pool more than most. So you can see this indicated in this list on the left of the top hirers in 2017 and 18. Optional practical training, by the way, is the name of one of the types of employment authorization for international students. And you can see from this kind of like shopping list of big names in tech that these large companies are very familiar with the benefit of hiring international students and grads. Meanwhile, the table on the right shows a breakdown of the top 11 industries that sponsored former international students for permanent residency in 2019. As you can see, while this is concentrated in certain key industries, there is quite a broad variety of career outcomes overall. International students and graduates are highly mobile, and in my experience, they won't hesitate to relocate for a job. In other words, they'll gladly head off to Silicon Valley if they can't find employment closer to where they study. So as many people know, keeping talented college graduates local is a great tool for economic development in general too. Next slide, please. According to a survey by the American Council on Education, more than a quarter of US respondents in 2021 believe that international students who remain in the US after graduation take jobs away from Americans. However, economic data suggests that the opposite is the case. A 2018 study by Business Roundtable, which explored the potential impact of removing the student's right to work after graduation, projected a loss of 255,000 jobs for Americans and a $52 billion reduction in GDP over the subsequent decade, which was associated directly with the mooted cancellation of that optional practical training work authorization. International graduates not only fill much needed job roles in the economy, they also tend to be more entrepreneurial than a typical college graduate. To quote one report by the National Foundation on American Policy, in 2018, nearly 1/4, or 20 out of 91 of the billion-dollar companies in the US had a founder who first came to America as an international student. On average, these billion-dollar companies employ more than 1,200 people each. I've included some examples on this slide of companies founded or co-founded by former international students, prominent examples of which are Michelle Zatlyn of Cloudflare, Nubar Efhayan, who founded Moderna, and of course, everyone's favorite, Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX. A lot of folks in international education love to refer to Elon Musk as like a key example of international graduate success. So hopefully I've given a basic impression of the economic value of enrolling international students and keeping hold of them after graduation. to say nothing, of course, of the positive social and cultural effects they have on their places of study and in the workplace. So now I'll hand over to Maria, who will speak about how to hire and retain international students and graduates. So thank you, Maria. So next slide, please, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah, and we can jump on the next slide as well. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you, Bill, for the educational segment on data. Elon Musk is actually one of my favorite examples to give. Simply because he's actually founded multiple companies and started multiple companies for the United States, and it employs an enormous amount of US workers at this stage. But the important thing to actually start thinking about when you're an employer is that there's so little known about the immigration system, especially the employment-based immigration system and the corporate immigration systems. That is just not in the media, and it's not covered. And the dichotomy that we're now seeing with what we're seeing on TV and what is actually real life is leaving a lot of people actually taken aback when they meet a foreigner. The immigration system in the United States, and this comes from a foreigner that had to walk the path from an F1 through an H1B to a green card, is contrary to what many say, not as archaic and not as rigid as people believe. It has a letter for, a letter of the alphabet is assigned to pretty much every visa. There is a visa for every letter in the alphabet that serves a different purpose. And many, if not most, of the visa statuses that are programmed into the system and built into the system are actually to address employment needs and carry some form of employment authorization that can benefit employers and international students alike. So some of the most common scenarios and visas that both international students have to deal with and employers encounter when they're vetting their employees that can actually lead to good, strong candidates that you can retain as talent, for example, are the F1 international student visa, which carries with it two potential built-in work authorizations. One is while the student is enrolled in school, if the school is properly set up, it could offer curriculum practical training for internship opportunities, unlimited part-time work of that. Or after graduation, at a minimum 12 months of optional practical training for most majors. And for those that are interested or working in a science, technology, engineering, or mathematics identified field, those individuals get an additional 2 years of optional practical training for a total of 3 years of work authorization, for which an employer does not have to pay a cent for. That is entirely within the control of the international student. And it kind of gives the international student the opportunity to prove themselves in their employment opportunity and to their employer to see and plan next steps. It's also the period that international students can use to determine whether they really want to stay in the US market and continue developing their careers here, or relocate and seek other opportunities. The other biggest visa that employers, US employers work with and rely on is the infamous H-1B visa, which many people hate to love. That visa was created specifically for high-skilled professional employees. It is subject to an annual quota, and we'll delve very deeply into that category. But it's a visa that was meant to fill areas of shortage where it's hard to find qualified candidates. There is a lot of sister categories for the work authorization visas, especially related to the H-1B visa, are subcategories for professionals that were really carved out based on agreements between the United States and various countries. So if you're an international student from Canada, Mexico, Australia, Singapore, or Chile, you have additional options beyond your F1 OPT, beyond an H-1B visa, or all the other work authorizations. And if you're an employer that has a candidate from one of those countries, there are specific visas created based on trade agreements that have significantly eased requirements for obtaining those visas. And all those visas are actually work authorized. So TNs are specifically created for Canadian and Mexican citizens. E3s were specifically created for Australians, and H1B1s were specifically created for Singaporean or Chilean citizens. All of those visas are pretty much created for professionals like the H1B visa, but do not carry the full workload that an employer has to pull and can usually be obtained in a matter of a few weeks. Since we actually have someone from academia, for people that are in the area of research and academia, people that are publishing, or people in the arts and media that are performers, there's work authorized visas called O1 visas, or as I refer to them, visas for extraordinaires, that were created for people that can show extraordinary ability in their specific field and arguably demonstrate that they've reached the top of their field. Those are rarer in the corporate context and business context, but very frequently and heavily utilized in academia for professor level positions, researcher level positions. And, based on my old experience with the firm I started with, models, performers, music and theater, and otherwise, as well as a plethora of other scientific fields that they can be utilized in. Harder standard to meet, but also a very valid option for people that are seeking to remain in the US or for an employer that's seeking to hire. We're not going to delve too much into that particular visa category because it's very specific and you can spend an hour just on it. But I'll be open for any questions if there's specific situations that either the employer side or international students want to be discussing at the end of the session. Finally, there's a lot of spouses around, and a lot of those spouses are allowed to work. And if you get candidates or have a spouse who's in a work authorized visa, sometimes you can be their dependent spouse and still be allowed to work. So nowadays you can find H4 work authorized spouses. Those are the spouses of H1B professionals. L2 spouses, who are the spouses of L1 workers. J2s, who are the spouses of J1 scholars or J1 trainees, which are an entirely separate work authorized category. Or E2 spouses, who are the spouses of E investors or traders in the United States. All of those spouses do not have to work for their principal visa holders, and they have market-wide authorization for as long as their spouse is actually maintaining their status. Let's proceed to the next slide so we can actually kind of group the categories, especially for an employer and really for an international student as well, of how you can view the various employment authorization visas that you have to be dealing with. On one hand, you have visa categories that you do not, as the employer, do not have to do anything to sponsor. Meaning if you get a candidate that you really like and you want to hold on to, and they're in one of those statuses, you do not have to sponsor them to hire them. You kind of get a free trial period to see whether you like the employee before you have to make up your mind of further investing in keeping them on board. So those particular visa categories are the dependents I just spoke about, the H4 spouses, the J2s, the E2s, and the L2s predominantly. And of course, your international students. The beauty of the F1 international program is that the category, for all its downsides, was built with a lot of flexibility for the students and for the employers to give the student an opportunity to fully develop their skills during their program. And on the other hand, you're going to have candidates or people on a visa that you would have to immediately do something for or about in order to retain their talent. That would be someone who's already on an H-1B visa and you want to hire. You can transfer them but that requires a proactive step on your part as an employer. Or you can have an individual in one of the top section who's on an F1 OPT that is expiring and cannot be renewed. Then you know that you would need to find an alternative for them. So when you're, if you're an employer and you're dealing with a candidate that you like, it's okay to get to know their story, and it's okay to get to know what their immigration status is and what you as the employer might need to do in order to retain them. There is a lot of flexibility out there in the system. There's a lot of attorneys. For example, our firm provides courtesy consultations for employers that have never gone through a visa process, but are finding themselves looking for candidates and finding good qualified foreign workers that they want to retain somehow. And we can move on to the next slide. And again, the biggest group that as an employer you're going to see are the international students. And to any of my international students that are actually on the call and listening there, it's very important to know what your status actually authorizes you to do, and how to take full advantage of what the F category offers, especially because it becomes crucially important when you're doing your OPT time to get that employer and find that opportunity that you want to explore and be able to prove yourself during your OPT. So when time comes for the H-1B lottery, you can have an open conversation with your manager, approach them and explain to them that the F1 visa will only take you that far, but beyond a certain point, the employer would have to take steps. So let's start with the F1 international student visa. That's the visa I started off on in 2004 when I first came to the US to pursue my undergrad studies. Unlike the smart people who go for a STEM discipline, I really wanted to work with people and went for a sociology degree and then for a law degree, and neither one of those is STEM. So I, upon graduation, was only authorized to work for 12 months on my optional practical training. So all F1s definitely are allowed to work for 12 months at the end of their programs. If they pursue a program up, Chelsea's going to explain that there's further authorizations that they can get, but at a minimum 12 months. Now, if your students are or candidates are in a field that's a discipline within the science, technology, engineering, and math areas, the STEM fields, such as biology, chemistry, computer science, those people can extend their 12-month initial authorizations for an additional 24 months. So they actually can get 3 years of OPT time working for an employer. The only catch to getting that particular extension for an OPT worker is that the company they're working for needs to be on E-Verify. And E-Verify is an online system that was created by the US government to not replace, but to make the I-9 verification process much easier for employers. It's free to register. It's very fast to register. It flags issues when you add your employees. So nowadays, most employers opt to join E-Verify in order to actually expand their talent pool and be able to retain international students and take advantage of potentially 3 years of work authorization during which the students will be able to prove themselves and the employer will have time to decide whether to further sponsor them. So for F1 students, once we graduate, that optional practical training is market-wide. The only catch is it kind of has to be related to what we studied. For example, I studied sociology. Chances are, if I wanted to magically start programming and be a computer scientist, that would not have boded well with my school advisor and would not have flown well. So luckily, the relationship needs to be reasonable. So there is a lot of flexibility on what the international student can do based on the degree that they've earned. The beautiful part of optional practical training and being on an F1 is that the employer doesn't have to do anything. And the international student is the one that's in control of that status, and it behooves them to always keep in touch with their student advisors and advise them ahead of time of what ideally they want to do so they can avoid any issues. The employer gets the equivalent of a US worker when they're hiring an F1 worker, at least for the amount of time that they have on that F1 OPT. For my international student peeps, please always check and run your plans by your international student advisor so they can tell you in advance whether you can do something or not. I've started my career as an attorney having to reinstate 3 international students in a row who simply disregarded what their student advisors were telling them. Reinstatements are hard, especially nowadays with processing times, and it's not a position that you want to be in to risk the status that you've had. You do not have to rely on any employer because you have market-wide authorization. You can also change employers during your OPT for my international students. While you're in school, your options are a little more limited in terms of what you can do and whether you can work off campus. But nowadays, I think that most schools have actually realized that international students also need the ability to complete internships, and those internships cannot really be completed on campus. So there is an increasing availability of what's called curriculum practical training, or CPT. Now, to my knowledge, at least when I was on an F1 doing CPT during the summer months, part-time CPT is unlimited. So you can have an internship in every single summer vacation as long as it's part-time. But if you do CPT full-time, you want to make sure that you are not going over 12 months of CPT. If you hit 1 year of full-time CPT, that gets counted against your optional practical training and you lose the OPT. So if you want to do full-time CPT, my old DSO used to tell me, cut it off at 11 months, and that is it, as a rule of thumb. And my old school just had that rule in their particular sections. But CPT also authorizes you before you complete your degree to explore internship opportunities and show what you can and secure employment for after you graduate for OPT. And as a reminder, neither CPT nor OPT needs to be sponsored by the employer. This is something that's entirely in the hands of the hire of the international student. They have to go to their student advisors, they have to present the documents, obtain the required I-20 forms, and they do all the work. All the employer needs to get is proof of employment ability. And Sarah, we can move on to the next slide. So the typical path of an international student is to attend school, work or not on CPT before they graduate, do their optional practical training for 12 or 3 years, depending on what field they're in. And at some point during their OPT, talk to their employers to see if they can be moved on to another visa, because as beautiful as F1 is, it runs out unless you're the perpetual student, and at some point we can only go up as far as in PhD if we really wanted to push it. So at some point during your OPT, you would have to have a frank conversation with your manager. So use your OPT wisely, make sure you're happy at the employer where you are, prove yourself, do your job. And the only thing that really works for us international students is that as long as we get our job done, and we do tend to become indispensable parts of the teams. And if you spend 6 months to 9 months with an employer, it becomes very hard for the employer to want to part ways with you because they would have to retrain a new employee. So having a conversation with your manager at some point before your OPT is running out is very good. Larger employers are already in the business of doing this, but I have to tell you that a very large portion of my clientele is smaller employers that have never sponsored visas. And it's just, I can tell you that it's even harder for a smaller employer to part with their employee. So I have extensively worked with corporations of far less than 25 employees and startups that have been able to sponsor H-1Bs for F1 international students that have contributed to the business operations during that particular year of OPT. So ultimately, when you're expiring at some point, you have to move on, and most F1 international students have to move on to an H-1B visa. It's a very natural progression because the H-1Bs for professionals or people that have at least a bachelor's degree that's closely related to what they're working on and the field they're in. So you have 6 years on an H-1B, and at some point, ideally in year 4, you want to make sure that someone starts a green card process for you, or, you know, if you have a personal route to a green card, you can also explore that. But Sarah, let's move on to the next slide and we can jump directly into the H-1B visa, which is really the meat and potatoes of what corporate immigration lawyers do. And really the one visa that pretty much every F1 student requires after they're done, with very few exceptions. So H-1Bs, again, they were created to retain highly skilled professionals for specialty occupations. Highly skilled professionals are people that have at least a bachelor's degree or higher in an area that they're working in and specializing in. And specialty occupations are positions that are complex enough to require someone that has a bachelor's or higher degree to do them. They're granted for a maximum period of 6 years in 2 3-year chunks. Most of them are subject to an annual quota with 65,000 slots allocated for people that hold a bachelor's degree and an additional 20,000 that are reserved for people that have completed a US master's degree. There is a segment of H-1B eligible occupations and employers that do not have to go through the quota. They're exempt. There's H-1Bs for them at any point. So if you're a research organization that's bona fide, focusing entirely on research, if you're a nonprofit that's affiliated with institutions of higher learning, or if you're an institution of higher learning, you're CAP exempt. And you do not have to go through the annual lottery that we will talk about in a little bit. The beautiful part is that if you meet an H-1B holder, he has either been counted against the lottery or there is a way to transfer that H-1B onto a new employer. Once that H-1B is secured, there's a lot of flexibility on it being transferred to other employers, even though it requires some steps on the part of the US company. Sarah, let's jump to the next slide so we can talk about generally what H-1B visas are focusing on. So they must be sponsored by a US employer, meaning you have to have an FEIN as a company and be registered and be doing business. They have to be for a specialty occupation, meaning you can't just sponsor your cook on an H-1B. That's not the proper visa, but if he's a really good cook, we can probably get him an O1. Because the role that you're sponsoring needs to be complex enough. And that can be shown either by your prior hiring practices or through advertisements or through general detailed research and explanation of what the duties are. The degree the person has to be related to what they're doing. There has to be a reasonable connection that can be explained to immigration. And you have to be specific as to what the details of the job will be. Where is the job going to be done? How much are you going to be paying to the worker? And essentially what the worksite location is, if it's more than one. So speaking of prevailing wages, those are determined by the Department of Labor. They get issued every July 1st of every year. They're classified in broad occupational classifications. And usually when you're doing an H-1B, you have to go through the Department of Labor and first obtain what's called a labor conditions application, which takes about a week to get. Now, we do recommend working with attorneys because with prevailing wages, I know a lot of employers are actually worried that they might not meet the standard. The standards are published, they are available online. So if you look for prevailing wages, there is a data center maintained by the Department of Labor where all employers can see them, even international students can see them. Do not get taken aback if you think that you have the right code, but the prevailing wage looks too high. Work with an attorney, because we are pretty good at being able to classify the roles properly and allowing you some flexibility on the wage that you would have to pay. So the procedures for an H-1B, any H-1B requires a labor conditions application, which details the title, the general occupation scope, how much the position is going to be paid based on the prevailing wage, and where the position will be located, where the work will be done. These are attestations the employer makes, takes a week to get. And once that is done, the rest of it are a few basic forms and a good letter that explains really what immigration would be looking for in order to grant the case. Processing times, currently, H-1B petitions normally would take about 4 to 5 months to process, but with what's called premium processing, you can pay a little extra to put immigration on a 2-week clock to get you the adjudication much quicker. I call it a nuisance fee because immigration has been raising it from $1,000 and change to $1,440, and after it was $1,440, it is now $2,500. So the premium processing cost is very, very vividly determined as a USCIS nuisance cost if you want to put them on a 15-day clock, but if you must, you must. We'll talk about what cases need to be put on premium processing when we're talking about the overall timelines for preparation and processing. But for now, let's move on to the next slide, and we can delve a little bit deeper into the lottery. So the most common H-1B visa for private employers who are not institutions of higher learning, they're not research centers, they're not nonprofits that are affiliated with institutions of higher learning, would be subject to the H-1B cap, which has been a lottery since pretty much 2008, which was right about the time when I was graduating from my bachelor's degree. And I didn't make that lottery. That I can tell you for sure, because that's how I ended up in law school. In days past, the lottery required employers to blindly mail fully prepared petitions between April 1st and April 5th of each year, with all the required filing fees, and wait until about July to find out for sure if someone was selected or not. Because what immigration used to do is collect all the full filings, draw a computer lottery, and send receipt only to the people that were selected, and wait until July-ish or even sometimes August to return the rejected petitions by USPS. So a lot of people were actually extremely nervous when the lottery was run that way. In 2020, partially because of COVID, partially because of Steve Miller, the registration period was actually introduced, and the way the lottery was done was completely changed. So now what we have is every March 1st, the lottery opens what's called a registration period, in which every employer that knows and potentially wants to sponsor an H-1B employee creates an account with USCIS as the employer and registers the name and the education level in which cap the person would be eligible for their candidate. Each registration is $10. The registration period stays open for 2 to 3 weeks. This year it closed on the 18th. And once the window closes, immigration then runs their lottery between the closing period and April 1st. So by April 1st, all people that are selected get a notification, and people that are not selected can definitively say, we have not been selected yet. Why am I saying yet? Because once you get selected, you get 90 days to file that big chunk of paper with immigration that actually represents the official petition with the filing fees. And because of COVID and ongoing troubles and duplicative entries, what we've seen over the past couple of years since this method was implemented is that people didn't necessarily file their petitions within the first 90 days, or they filed petitions that they shouldn't have. And because of rates of denials and because of rates of filing, we have consistently been seeing that this method around August of every year has been yielding a second draw to the lottery, where more people would be selected and given another 90 days to process. So with the lottery, every April 1st, employer finds out who's been selected. If they've been selected for those $10, then they have 90 days to decide and file the full-blown petition. On the bright side, this process also benefits a lot of international students because, let's face it, OPT, usually when we graduate in May, the latest we can get the OPT, if we really push it, is August, I have seen. And that makes it really hard to have to wait to find out if you're selected in the lottery, and finding out in April versus July gives you a lot more time to determine whether you have visa backup options. Let's move on to the next slide. So the first phase is that pre-registration, $10 a pop, costs really nothing. The employers can do it on their own. They don't even have to use an attorney to do it. I know that our firm has actually provided a lot of instructions, especially to late registering employers, on how to actually register their employees on their own, and we've only been retained sometimes when we have a definitive confirmation. So the big second phase, though, is once you know that your worker has been selected in the lottery, you have to actually file your petition. They give you 90 days from April 1st, ends on June 30th. So when you're filing a petition, and if you're an employer that doesn't normally do them, what you have to think about is, how would a lay officer or a lay person, officer of USCIS, think about granting that H-1B? So number one is, well, they need to know who you are and that you're a legitimate business. If you're a larger corporation, promotional materials help, a brief blur and a letter that explains what your business is about is often enough. If you're a smaller corporation, you absolutely are entitled, but then you have to, and I usually advise clients, spend a little more time explaining what your business is, what the model is, how many employees you have, and how is the work divided amongst those employees, what are some of the clients that you're working on, so immigration can get the full beauty of everything that you do. I can give you an example. One of my favorite old clients was a jazz club in New York City. And I couldn't get enough of having to describe exactly how old that jazz club was, who was playing in that jazz club, how many tickets were being sold, and why that jazz club needed a good marketing campaign in the 21st century to keep people coming. The offered position needs to be detailed. That's the other big chunk, has to be a specialty occupation. So the occupation being sponsored, for one, you need to have a business need for it, because otherwise, if there is a disconnect, immigration is not going to react well to it. But if there's a legitimate business need to have a marketing coordinator for a jazz club of the caliber that I was working with, then you most definitely are entitled to detail all the work the person will be doing, what the duties are, and what your education requirements are. So it has to be a bachelor's degree that's related to the work that's being done. And finally, immigration wants to know something about that beneficiary, that international student, that foreign worker that you want to sponsor. Why do you want to sponsor them? How are they qualified? So they want to know what their degree is, how the degree is related, and sometimes, depending on the situation, whether there's any related experience. All of them can be added in a letter and explained and supplemented with education documents, passports, proofs of status, promotional materials for your businesses, so you can educate immigration on what you do. Some special considerations. If you're a smaller entity, you might want to make sure that you emphasize the clients that you have and the business that you've been able to do over the years, in order to confirm for immigration that if you're asking for 3 years of H-1B time, you'll be able to fill that 3 years of H-1B time and continuously give work to that employee. He or she is not gonna be running out of work. And finally, if you're in consulting and you have to send your employees to various sites, what you wanna make sure is that you upfront show immigration who has the right to control the work, and show immigration that you are the actual employer, as opposed to your end client. Let's move on to the next slide. And finally, let's cover the timelines and the costs. So the cap subject H-1Bs are the ones that really you have to plan out, because they start March 1st with the pre-registration. You find out if you're selected in April, you have to file by June. And the initial approval, the earliest approval date is for October 1st. So that's when the person can start. With respect to change of employers or cap exempt HS, so if you're an institution of higher learning, a research center, a nonprofit organization with proper affiliations, H-1Bs can be prepped and filed in 2 to 3 weeks once we have the information. And once you have the information, a week for the LCA, a week for the rest of the documents. Let's build in a week for prepping and organizing everything, 2 to 3 weeks. If you're doing a change of employer, meaning you have and you're hiring someone who has an H-1B, not only can you prep in 2 to 3 weeks and file with USCIS, but the regulations allow the H-1B to start working for you as soon as immigration receives that petition in the mail. You don't have to wait for the approval. So the H-1B category is extremely versatile. Once you get the number, or if you have a candidate that's already gotten their lottery number, you can transfer them, and there's a lot of flexibility there. In terms of costs, you can account for, legal fees, because most employers want to use attorneys. Legal fees ranging between $4,000 and $5,000, and you have to account for USCIS's filing fees. Without premium processing, they vary between about $1,710 for employers that have 25 or less employees, and they range to about a little less than $2,500 for corporations or businesses that have more than 25 employees. And with that, that is the crash course on H-1B, F-1, and work authorizations. And we can certainly address any questions that you have, but I'll turn it over for the moment to Chelsea, so she can also tell you a little bit about.
Maria, I might intersect for just 1 second, because I have a confirmation question. So something that surprised me during our chat yesterday was how cheap it is for employers to do that very first step, which is entering the lottery. Can you remind us how much it costs for employers to do that?
$10. So
$10.
If you have an employee, it's 2 Starbucks coffees to find out if you can have them here for another 3 years. And on top of that, you also get the 90 days to continue to confirm that you actually want to proceed with the rest of the steps and file that petition.
Yeah, so I think this is something that's great for employers to be aware of, the fact that they're not on the hook for, many thousands of dollars for something that's a complete chance. Like, they pay $10 for the lottery, and then once the employee or the candidate is picked in the lottery, that's when the other costs arise. So it's not like you're throwing away like a $10,000 fee on a chance. So thank you for that clarification, Maria. All right, Chelsea, I'm sorry for wading in. Thanks, Maria. Chelsea, go ahead. Thank you.
I'm not worried about it at all, Maria. It's always great to hear you talk and get a refresher on all of that. So it's good to see you. So my name's Chelsea, as Bill said. I am currently the Assistant Director of Program Assessment and Operations. It's a really long title. Essentially, I do data and operations within the co-op office at Drexel. Next slide, please. So a little bit about me, just to give some background. I previously did work, as Maria was mentioning, as an international student advisor. So I'm very well versed, especially when it comes to the F1 student visa and getting students on CPT and OPT, which is really what Drexel is known for. And now I'm just working in data and assessment, so helping international students getting those jobs. And then just for fun, the brick wall in my background is real. I live in Old City, Philadelphia. Next slide. So focusing mostly on what we're seeing with international students and employment in Philadelphia, or generally speaking with the US, especially when it comes to COVID, as I don't think this comes as a surprise to anybody, but since 2019, we've seen about an 8% decrease, which I think is actually pretty optimistic. I'll get more into what's going on right now. We see those numbers bouncing back really strong, but COVID certainly hit the international community pretty hard. We see about a 60-40 male-female split. and a large percentage of students coming from Asia. And as Bill mentioned, a majority of the students are coming on those 3 majors that you see listed. Usually, just from stories, it's because of that STEM extension that Maria mentioned, that they're focusing on those majors specifically. And on the next slide, in Philadelphia, we still see about 78% of our students getting work in the region specifically. A lot of students at Drexel are excited about Philadelphia and want to stay in the area. And though a lot of them do have that opportunity to move, at least while they're in school, they like to stay here. Philly's a fun city. Last year, we saw about 120 students working outside of the US. Again, that is impacted by COVID. Many of them were working in their home countries. Usually that number is probably about 3 times higher, but at this moment, we have at Drexel 780 students who are on OPT or STEM OPT, and 356 international students who are on co-op for spring, summer. So I guess a little background, if people aren't familiar, Drexel is built, we're on a quarter system, so we have 4 quarters in a year, and our program is built for students to work while they're in school. So students can work anywhere from 6 months to 1.5 years, all on CPT. So students, international students specifically, can usually work about 1 year full-time while in school. Doesn't cost anything to the employer, doesn't cost anything to the student. They get that sponsorship as part of their F1 visa. And then they usually, if they're doing a 3rd co-op, that 3rd co-op will be part-time, just to meet that same requirement that Maria mentioned. They can't go over 1 year of full-time work. And as I mentioned before, just that the second to last bullet, we are seeing numbers of unemployed students coming back in 2022. We really are, we see 97% of our students, and that's not just a made up number, I work in data. So 97% of our students who are looking to work right now are getting to work. So people are interested in Drexel students and international students in general. I don't need to reemphasize what Bill and Maria already said. They're just amazing and getting all these opportunities. Next slide, please. So a lot of questions that we get at the Career Center is, how are we preparing the students for some of the challenges that they face? They're coming to a new culture and they need to make friends, adjust to college life. And then on top of that, they're looking to find jobs in their 2nd, 3rd, or 4th languages. And most colleges, not just Drexel, or every college I would venture, has a lot of these options or a lot of these offerings. But specifically at Drexel, we have career fairs where we invite employers to come and meet the students. A lot of times they're major specific. So we'll have STEM career fairs, nursing career fairs, whatever you're looking for. And students are always notified about those. We recently started a career closet to help students who may not be able to afford to get their career wardrobe off the ground. We have an entire office space dedicated to career appropriate clothing, and students can come and shop for free. The kickoff was last week, and we had 200 students come and pick out clothing so that they could be ready for their interviews and their jobs. We've also started with, last fall, we started offering students the opportunities to have their headshots taken, and we bring in a professional photographer and, give students their best opportunity to update their LinkedIn profile or however they want. We also offer alumni career panels, and then staff in the office will do mock interviews for students. And then in preparation for the students' co-op opportunities, they all have to participate in Co-op 101. It's a quarter-long class where we go through resume skills, LinkedIn skills, interviewing skills, everything and anything to get them ready for the upcoming opportunities and really to give them their best shot at getting jobs. Next slide, please. And then some of the tips that we give specifically to international students, and Maria really addressed some of these already. International students don't need that visa sponsorship for the first 1 to 3 years after graduation. And if there is CPT opportunities at the school, that can be even longer. For our students, they get 1.5 years of work before they graduate, and then an additional 1 to 3 years, depending on their major. And we really tell students to be confident when it comes to talking about OPT and CPT, because we know this is intimidating to employers and they think that it's very cumbersome, but if the student comes and is like, nope, you don't need to sponsor me, we think it really gives them a great shot. So being confident to talk about their visa to anybody who asks. And, you know, as Maria said, and I will echo, always talk to the International Student Advisor. They really are your best resource. We're not emailing you to be annoying. We're not emailing you to get you in trouble. We really have your best interests at heart. And we're trying to help you the best that we can. And then a question we get all the time is that jobs can be paid or unpaid. I know everybody hopes to get that dream job at Google making 6 figures, but a really great way, I think all of us will, you know, speaking from my own experiences, my first job was unpaid, and eventually my employer did offer me a paid job. So you never know where the paid job is coming from. And then just other fun facts, I guess, that I was looking up this morning. I didn't have time to update my slides, so I apologize. But we do find that a number of our international students, whether they accepted paid or unpaid jobs, about 46% of them will eventually receive full-time offers after graduation from their co-op employers. So it gives them that opportunity to build that relationship with them and continue that relationship after graduation. Next slide, please. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Chelsea, thank you so much for that. That was a really helpful insight into how universities deal with those questions and obviously preparing international students for graduation. I also really enjoy how you say, next slide, please. I'm going to borrow that for future reference. Sarah, could we hop to the next slide, please? So now we have a few minutes for Q&A. Chelsea and Maria, do you have a few more minutes to stick around if folks want to stay on and hear the answers to some of the questions we didn't get to yet? We've had a busy Q&A section, so I think we've answered most of these in the Q&A function, but there are some pre-submitted questions we didn't get to yet. Maria, are you currently typing an answer to anything on? No. Okay, so I'm going to read out. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I noticed a couple of really good questions. So I'm only suspecting that one came from an international student. International students are often very afraid that the employer will hear they have to expend money on their H-1B and would never want to sponsor. It's not necessarily the case. Every employer knows that for the money they pay as a salary, they get a lot more from the employee. That's why employers want to hold on to their employees and not have to have a revolving door, because they actually are benefited from investing in their workforce. The employers that I actually work with, I do work with large employers, but I've worked with a number of smaller ones. A jazz club, for all its glory, is not a very big employer. It has about 15 employees, and probably doesn't make that much. But the jazz club realized that their international student was giving them a lot of clients through their marketing efforts and sponsored the H-1B without any hesitation. I have had a karaoke bar as a client. I have had all sorts of fun clients, and none of them backed off of their employees simply because the costs associated with an H-1B seemed to be too high. They get repaid over time, most certainly, especially when they get an employee that's going to be with them for a good 3 to 6 years and might be planning for a green card. So it's always, you know, never think of it as they will see the cost and they'll not want to deal with me. Employers also invest in their US workforce just as they would invest in an H-1B. Ultimately, it's just the cost of doing business. And the other really good question, and something that actually, oh, well, no, I responded to this question and I need to pull it up. It was a wonderful question that I just recently responded to. Someone asked me, what is the situation for postdocs and the lottery? Postdocs are US master's caps. The way the lottery is drawn is something I forgot to tell you. US master's degrees are benefited. They get 2 bites at the apple at the lottery stage, because the way the lottery is drawn is all the registrations are put in one pool, from which the first drawing is for the 65,000 slots available. And then only the US masters and higher degrees get separated and put into the pool for the additional 20,000 slots. So if you have a candidate that has a US master's or a higher degree, like a postdoc or a PhD, then you definitely can expect that they might have statistically a better chance of being selected.
Thank you. Someone just asked a question, which I think is really, it came up in a few different iterations in the pre-submitted questions. So they asked Chelsea specifically, but it's a question I guess we could all tackle on our own if we wanted to. In addition to encouraging students to advocate for themselves, which I know we all do, are there other ways you engage with employers to educate them on how easy and great it is to engage with international students? I find I'm met with a lot of resistance because of the assumption that sponsoring takes a lot of resources, or HR folks just aren't up to date on OPT processes and eligibility. And I think, this is one of the reasons why we organize this session, and we'll have it posted prominently on YouTube, and we'll share it out as much as possible, because we want to underscore the fact that it is much easier than people think. And it's a question, I suppose the question that was phrased in other ways was, what strategies would we suggest for international students to employ to use when they're talking to employers, or how do they bring up this conversation when talking to employers? My usual advice for students when they were in the interview process was not to start out by saying I'm on a student visa, but wait until they'd proven their value through the immigration process. And yes, occasionally that had the painful effect if you get to the last round of interviews, and then you have to fill out a form, and they might say, sorry, we don't sponsor, but at least it doesn't say stop the process at square one. Would Chelsea or Maria, would you have any thoughts on those questions?
Sure. I would echo your sentiments. It's always great to build a relationship with your employer. Don't need to share that information up front, especially because there is zero effort needed very early on for employers. And when you get to the later stages, it's important to talk about, but not important right away. As far as what we do to educate employers, I think that's a great point. We have an entire team built to onboard employers and talk through the benefits of hiring students in general, but when we're helping them format their job descriptions. One of the questions is, does this need to be a US citizen? And we have a long conversation with them about, do you actually need this to be a US citizen? Is there, government secrets that you're working with that require whatever it is? And we usually are successful in educating employers about how easy it is to educate. I think it comes, the more people who tell an employer, from both our standpoint of helping them to find students, and then from the student perspective as well, the better. So we just have to reiterate over and over again. It's very easy.
I agree. So when I was on an F1, I had the exact same fears, but my DSO, my student advisor, said, look, you get that OPT and it's market-wide. You have the same rights as a US employee. So when you're applying, it depends. If the application asks you, will you at any point in the future require sponsorship? Yes, don't lie, tell them that you would. But chances are, if you see that question, that's an employer that already is aware and has maybe sponsored in the past. That's not going to prevent them from interviewing you, especially if you have a good resume. And as you start working, if they hire you and they're fully aware that you've proven your employment verification by giving them that OPT card, then the relationship is between you and your manager. Put in your blood, sweat, and tears in that work. And eventually, when the time comes, I usually tell people around January, because in March the registrations happen, sit down and have a frank conversation. Should we try and put $10 to see if I get selected, and then get the 90 days to see if we're going to file a petition for me? Do you want me to stay long term? Because, depending on the actual area you're in, you do make invaluable contributions and developments for many businesses. And businesses, for international students, what I usually say is, we do offer courtesy calls for employers that have never sponsored, especially when they have someone that they really like. What can we do? What costs are we looking at? And how long is it going to take? Will I lose them at any point? Those are the most common questions that the employer has. And at least at the firm, we're very happy to talk to an employer that's interested, because it's not really that hard. And even though the H-1B is a lottery, when it needs to happen, it happens. I got through the lottery, luckily. Many people get through the lottery, and it's definitely, given that it's $10, it's worth a shot. And it's worth a shot having a conversation, especially if the employer sees potential and talent that they don't want to lose. The system is extremely versatile, and any sort of employer can actually retain you. It doesn't have to be an established company. It could be a smaller one. Most of my clients, the ones that I end up retaining on my own, are usually smaller entities. Could be physical therapy, could be counseling, could be architects, or it could be startups that are developing some sort of hardware product. So for all of those, the visas are possible. And, you know, I always operate on the suggestion that one of my first mentors gave me, and it was, where there's a will, there's a way.
I mean, yeah, many international graduates have proven that there's a lot of truth in that. That's why we celebrate having so many of them around still. So there are a couple more questions that people pre-submitted, but I'll happily reach out and answer those individually, because they are things that are within my my realm of experience. So I wanted to just end by saying, firstly, just for anyone who's got more questions about the policy and sort of the legal side of things, Klasko has some great resources. If you visit their website, there's a newsletter where you can stay updated on immigration trends and policy. Of course, Maria's contact details are here too. So if you have specific questions for Maria, she can reach out and help. I know she has this kind of conversation with employers, potential employers, a lot, who end up hiring international students. So I want to say huge thank you to Maria and Chelsea for giving up some time today to share their experience and knowledge with everyone. I will say that at International House, we plan to continue organizing programming around employment for international students and graduates, among other things, including hopefully some opportunities down the road for employers to connect with international graduates directly. So please stay tuned. I will also send out an email shortly, including a link to this recording. And yeah, I hope we can stay in touch. Please reach out offline with any questions. And with that, I will say thank you once more, Maria. Thank you, Chelsea. And have a wonderful rest of the day, everybody.
You too.
Thank you.